Hey folks, my name is Ted Gutierrez and you are watching episode 14, I think it is, of the Business of Cyber show. Resources are slim in cybersecurity. That means that you've got to know where to use them and where to deploy them. That's what we talk about on this particular show. I'm super excited to talk about consultants and where they kind of can fit in to maximize your overall program maturity. And before I do, I wanted to just kind of open it up to what I'm seeing in the industry right now within critical infrastructure. Just got back from a CS4CA event in London, actually on a flight to go to the CS4CA event at ManuSec this afternoon to talk to manufacturing CISOs. And one of the things that I'm hearing around the globe is regardless of the amount of maturity a given organization has, they're still struggling across their resources. Now, when we think about resources in general, we talk on this show about time being a fleeting resource we never have enough of. We talk about budget, and the one that we're going to focus on today is people. And I thought that it was very important to mention that regardless of the sector, regardless of the maturity of any of the CISOs that I've worked with over the course of, let's say, last 6 to 12 months, the people side of the house is the one that is the most challenging. Right now, coming in a post-COVID world, we have a lot of challenges in people coming back to work, people not coming back from work. The overall concept of, do I need to stay at an organization for multiple years, or can I bounce around in kind of a gig economy? These are the challenges that CISOs are dealing with today. And I thought that it was extremely important to uncover and talk about something that I think people think about, but nobody ever brings front and center. And that is, what is the value of a consultant, an advisor, a trusted partner in your cybersecurity journey? And more specifically, what does that journey look like for an ISA IEC 62443-3-2? So what we put together was on this Business of Cyber shows, we're going to talk about how a consultant can actually accelerate that process. And I'm super excited to be joined by a friend and colleague from the industry, Mr. John Cusimano out of Pennsylvania. John, thanks for joining the show. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Ted. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, doing really good, doing really good. So we've known each other since what, maybe 2017 or 2018? Is that fair?
2 years for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's interesting, when we came up with this idea, we were actually on the phone for something totally separate. And even in the previous kind of call we had just in prep for this presentation, what I found interesting is our backgrounds, right? So we say consultant in the title, but we're talking about internal or an external consultant. And
Right.
one of the things, you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think what we're talking about is really an advisor, a facilitator, somebody, or not to say a person, but it could be obviously it could be a group of people, but to help guide through this process, this methodology that's defined in 62443-2, which is basically an OT cybersecurity risk study that many companies that are moving to a more risk-based approach are adopting, because the idea behind 3-2, which we're going to get into in a little bit, but the idea behind it is really it's meant to be a study, a risk study. You can almost think of it as a feed, a front-end engineering study, to understand where you need to put your resources, both people and dollars and technology, to best manage your risk. That's really the value of 3-2. It's called risk assessment for design. So it is really meant to be a precursor to designing your remediations.
Right. Well, we'll get into it a little bit deeper, but for the audience out there, one of the things that John and I both agree on is my background as an asset owner. I was actually an internal consultant, right? And I was auditing facilities globally, but I was actually a corporate entity that would then be bid out to various projects. When I left that company, I actually started my own consultancy, right? So from the perspective that I'm going to be bringing today is both from an internal trusted advisor as well as maybe an external. And I know that you've, in your career, moved across a lot of different types of companies, and then the resulting role that you have supporting asset owners, John. Tell us a little bit about that as we go to also looking a little bit about your overall experience, sir.
Yeah, actually, I started as an asset owner. Actually, my first job out of school was with Eastman, what is now Eastman Chemical, and so I started as an asset owner working in on control systems for chemical facilities, um, designing, deploying, configuring, testing, troubleshooting, the gamut. I really enjoyed that work actually. But life took me in a different direction, and so I moved and I took a job with a product company. I actually didn't think I would stay in product for very long, but I actually found it very exciting, and I spent really a total 19 years working for two different vendors in that space. And I was at that point then I was actually a product manager for two different product lines, controls, a DCS system and a safety system. I learned a lot, obviously, in that time period. And then life took me in a different direction again, and I had an opportunity to join a boutique, very niche consulting firm specializing in safety systems and certification of products for safety, which but my invitation to join them was to start a cybersecurity practice, and this was in 2009, before Stuxnet, before an industrial cybersecurity practice, and there really wasn't much of a industry at that point. It was a lot of talk and discussion, but it was a great opportunity to do that and to really get dive headfirst into this field. And that's really when I transitioned about 2009 into full-time into ICS OT cybersecurity. And then from there, I've stayed on the consulting engineering track, working for an engineering system integration company that had a cybersecurity practice that we sold to Deloitte. I was with Big Consulting for 2 years. Again, learned a lot about the big consulting world, but then decided that I wanted to go back. I really enjoy kind of smaller niche specialty consulting engineering, and that's what brought me to Armexa.
Awesome. I always find I like the diversification of your overall experience, right? You started off really in automation, understanding at a shop floor, whatever kind of facility it was. I think you said chemical.
Mhm.
This kind of the same with me. My start many years ago was actually root cause failure analysis for a specific tool type in an upstream capacity, right? That led me to quality control to quality assurance to risk management, and it all. So my background always comes from that auditing and that assessment world. I always have said that it is easier to transition a lot of times from an automation or an engineering or an OT role into cybersecurity to secure them, because you understand the business impacts, you understand the business outcomes, versus
Right.
somebody trying to take a traditionally IT cybersecurity knowledge base. That's pretty much what the majority of the world has had, right? And then transition to train OT. I don't know if you have any comments on that, but it's exciting to have you on the show today as we talk about 3-2. And we really talk about the value of any type of consultant to help accelerate that.
Yeah. So definitely,
So,
I do find it, Mike's, yeah, it's true for everyone, right? Your life experiences really kind of build who you are. But having been on that, particularly the years that I spent focused on safety were really beneficial. I learned all about process safety, functional safety, how to keep these facilities safe. And that's why when I had this opportunity to go join this firm and lead a cyber practice, at first I was like, well, is there going honestly the question was, is there going to be a market there? And
right,
the answer was, well, if these systems aren't secure, how can you make them, how can they be safe if they can
right.
be compromised? And that's really kind of was the light bulb moment to say, yeah, and then of course subsequent events like Stuxnet really kind of demonstrated that, oh yeah, this
Right.
is not just
This is real.
hypothetical, this is real.
Well, it's over a decade ago. I mean, for those in the audience, we are, I'm big into history, so the words are coming out. Founding father. I know you probably wouldn't love that title, but the truth is that OT cybersecurity didn't have a standard. OT cybersecurity didn't have a set of means to assess themselves, right? And one of the biggest, I think, celebrations that we have for the show today is we've had some folks that were early in the development and then the resulting adoption and scale of a lot of these different standards. We know that ISO IEC 62443 3-2 was one of those. For those that are listening in, John was one of the original contributing authors. So we thought it was appropriate, if for you to give a little bit of an overview for 7 to 10 minutes on your perspective of 3-2, what the real underlying foundation of need, what was the world like over a decade ago that pushed those folks to build that. And I think that will give us and give the audience a real foundation for why internal, external consultant can help. So if you're up for the challenge and charge, I'd love to hear your perspective on those things.
Sure, sure. So yeah, when I got involved in, I moved into this field around 2010. One of the first things I did is I got involved in the ISA 99 committee, and that's the committee that has been leading the 62443 development for well over a decade. And there's a lot of different committees you can get involved in. That's like 14 different working groups, I think, right now within ISA 99. So I kind of asked around about where might my skills fit, and people said, "Oh, you should get involved in this committee we have on zones and conduits," is what it was called. And that's actually was the name of the standard we were developing. Was a more detailed standard around how do you, the concept of zones and conduits was in 62443 from the very beginning, from the what we call the 1-1 and the 2-1 standards talk about zones and conduits, but there wasn't a lot of detailed information about requirements and how to partition a system into zones and conduits. They just said you needed to do it with a few examples. So 3-2 originally was going to be, I think it was going to be a technical report on how to partition the system into zones and conduits. And as we started talking through that, we kept coming back to this idea of, well, you're going to do it. It's based on risk, and we need to understand the risk to these assets, and we need to put them into zones, and we need to protect those zones. And again, it's a risk management exercise for each zone, and what are the the boundary controls you're going to put in place? What are the different controls you're going to put in place in this zone versus this zone, depending on risk? So we kept talking about risk, and we just eventually said, you know what, we need to broaden the scope of the standard. The standard really needs to be about how do you assess risk in an IACS, or control system environment. How do you manage that risk by partitioning a system into zones and conduits? And how do you decide what are the controls you need from a design perspective? How do you design to manage that risk once you've identified it? So that's how it eventually evolved into this security risk assessment. And then we added 4 system design. There was, every word in a standard takes weeks or months to get everybody to agree on. So it was a lot of discussion around just the title. And that's what we decided finally was a security risk assessment for design. In other words, it is something you want to do ideally in a greenfield application. You're going to do this during the design phase of your system. Obviously, you can apply the standard for brownfield, and it's applied all the time. But it's still about designing those controls that you're going to add to an existing system to manage the risk that you've assessed.
That's a good point. I've seen, just looking at the backdrop of where the macroeconomics fit for cybersecurity, I will tell you there's a larger number of people today that are building, like you said, greenfield, they're building new assets, or they're in a state of mergers and acquisitions of new assets to them that might be old, right? And how do they integrate those facilities, those business operations, that automation equipment, tons of different vendors, tons of different phases in their overall life cycle. More people are looking for a risk-based assessment today than I think they were 2 to 3 years ago, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so what does that do for the overall market when they have an increase in demand for ISA 62443? They start to learn a little bit. Maybe they take some of the certs and they say 3-2 is where we want to start. But I've always said that this process is not as much difficult as much as it is detailed, right? Where you pull in a known baseline of business outcomes, threats, your risk matrices. Do you have a good understanding of your systems under consideration, your zones? I'm going to open it up right here on the slide deck to your next slide. I'm going to come back to this one.
Sure.
But Would you walk us through the general diagram of how a 3-2 is rolled out to kind of lay the foundation of how many moving pieces there really are, John?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to your point, it's not a difficult process. But it is a detailed process. It's it is very much an engineering. We like to say that it's not a methodology. The words that are used in the standards is a workflow. It's a set of
Right.
requirements
Right.
because ISA in general philosophy around ISA is to not write prescriptive standards, to write performance-based standards. And so
Mhm.
what we want companies and users to be able to take this and modify it, apply it however they want to, as long as they meet the basic requirements. So you don't even have to do this. I mean, it's shown as a workflow, a sequential process, and it largely is sequential, but it's also a very iterative process. And I'll point that out as we go through this, that it's not kind of like, even though you can follow the arrows going kind of straight down the middle of the screen and do each step in sequence, the reality when you're doing these kind of studies is, it says first thing you need to do is identify the system under consideration. That's what's the scope of the assessment. That's fairly straightforward, right? But as you get into it, you may be like, oh, well, we forgot about this one package system over here that's really kind of part of this, and this needs to be brought into the system under consideration, or
Right.
those kind of things. So it's not like once you've set that, you can't modify that, but you do have to define what it is you're assessing. Then if you follow this diagram, it can look a little bit busy, but if you just follow it as a flow chart, kind of straight down from the start to the end, it's pretty
Mhm.
straightforward. Identify
Right.
what it is you're assessing, the scope of your study. Perform an initial risk assessment, and we kicked around that word an awful lot in the committee, but at one point it was high level, and we changed it to initial. The idea there is, before you dive down into the details, take a 10,000-foot view of your system and identify what are the worst case consequences if this system as a whole was to be compromised. It's really more of a consequence. What we call ZCR2, their zoning conduit requirement number 2, is really more of a consequence. What are the worst case consequences that are realistic, that could realistically that happen? Taking into account that you do have safeguards in place that usually can prevent worst case consequences. And the idea for that is really to kind of calibrate. If you do perform this initial cyber risk assessment and it indicates you've got pretty high risks, then you're definitely going to want to continue going down and breaking it and doing the more detailed study. If your initial risk assessment says this particular system under consideration really doesn't have very high consequences, um, and your risks are already within tolerable range, you may be able to justify not doing a detailed
Right.
study.
Right.
But you still have documented, yes, we thought about it. These were the parameters we looked at. These were the assumptions we made. And based on that, we're not going to do a detailed risk assessment on this particular system. We're going to go move our resources to another system that we consider
Right.
to be higher risk.
So right there's a lot packed into that. I want to kind of uncover it, and then we'll go back to your slide deck. The question is the following. We talked about really looking at all the different systems that you have. We talked about pulling in previous assessment data. We talked about pulling in threats and then kind of mashing all this together in somewhat of a risk methodology that you hope would be impacted by the corporate or influenced on what their tolerance levels are. Without getting into the details there, let's just talk resource allocation.
Mhm.
How many groups generally within an asset owner's environment are required to submit data, submit time, or submit some sort of input in order to make that an effective discussion?
Yeah, good question. Let me just back up to the initial, talk a little bit more about the purpose of that initial risk assessment, and give an example. So one of our clients has um, facilities globally all around the world, upstream,
Mhm.
midstream, downstream, oil and gas. Um, they have well over 300 systems, and and those are really large, process control networks that they counted up around the world. The purpose of the initial risk assessment is to go through those 300 and say, okay, without spending days per system to rank those. Well, actually, but you do spend some time doing that because you need that you need some basic information to be able to do that. But the first value of that initial risk assessment is to spend a reasonable amount of time to say, of my many systems, which ones do I need to address first? And as I said, justify maybe not doing a detailed risk assessment on some based on that. Then to answer your question about how many different groups need to be involved to get this information, that's one of the kind of tenets of the standard, is to recognize. You'll see on that diagram, there's inputs on the left and outputs on the right. The boxes on the left and the right of the workflow diagram are to show this is the information that's needed for this process, and that's going to come from different sources. For example, it talks about architecture diagrams, policies, tolerable risk guidelines, process hazard analysis, so previous risk assessment studies, standards, best practice, and so on. That's going to come from different sources, and it depends on the company where that's coming from. Some of it's going to come from your environmental health and safety, or your EH&S, whatever you call it. Some of it's going to come from your corporate governance. Some of it's going to come from IT and IT security policies. Some of it's going to come from external sources. For example, threat intelligence sources. So,
right.
the part of this process is gathering information from a lot of sources and different people that have the expertise, because no one person has all of the knowledge about a particular system to be able to really do a complete study. So you've got to get this information from a variety.
Nor should they, right?
Right.
So we know, like, we're gonna have to talk to risk, we're gonna have to talk to ops, we're gonna have to talk to architecture, we're gonna have to talk to obviously your security teams. We're gonna have to tie in with maintenance to understand the overall life cycle. We're probably gonna have to tie into some vendors too. So just the web of people, and then the data that those people have coming together, who generally, in your experience, is kind of owns the responsibility of corralling all those folks? I mean, the easy answer would be your senior security person, right? Which might be an OT security manager or director reporting up to the CISO. What say you on today versus maybe 5 years ago on who really owns corralling that responsibility?
Yeah. That's a really important thing to figure out as you embark on these, because I teach a class for ISA called IC33, and that's one of the things and the course is all around security risk assessment methodologies. It's largely based on 3-2, and that's one of the things we say when we talk about getting ready to do one of these studies or assessments. It's a project. Like any other project, you have to have a project manager. You have to define roles and responsibilities for the different people on the project. You have to set a budget. You have to set a schedule. These are mini projects. Some of these assessments can be done pretty quickly in a few weeks. Some of them, depending on the scope and scale, could take months. So you need to treat it like a project. You need to define, and one of the key things is you have to define who is your project manager. And that's where, because there's a lot of stakeholders, but somebody has to drive the process. And a lot of times, the stakeholder, the funding might come from ops, it might come from IT, from the CISO. There's no single answer, because the way that the different companies are organized in different ways. Some companies now actually have defined a role of a OT CISO, or a director of OT cybersecurity is becoming a much more common role in corporations.
Well, today versus even a couple of years ago. So going backwards just the tiniest bit, because I think it sets a good foundation, is the why 3-2 was developed. At its core, we talked a lot about safety. We can directly correlate safety to non-productive time, impact to operations. They're all kind of tied under one. And a colleague from from the industry. Dennis Parker said it best one day. He says, IT wants to patch at all costs, whereas OT wants to stay up at all costs safely, right? And so when you think about the real underlying foundation of why, I would like you to comment on some of these details you put in here for the audience, because there wasn't a security standard or risk methodology directly tied to that environment, which is laser focused on safety. 3-2 was developed, but because of the fundamental nature of how these threats can turn into real risks, and then you have to, of course, make decisions on where you're going to place limited resources. That's why this methodology was built. We have a question. Just one final point. We have a question based on our last conversation or last kind of statements about whether you're going to do a detailed risk assessment. The question was, so are we ignoring the low risk assets in the OT environment? I will pass all of that over to you, John, for a little bit of commentary on how challenging it is and why the 3-2 standard was developed.
Yeah, I will do my best to cover that. So, your previous guest, Dennis Parker and Kenny Mescar, were both on the committee with me for I think 7 years, once a week, meeting for at least an hour once a week to work through that, and with a number of other very dedicated people that served on this committee for, like I said, almost 7 years. But why we developed it. One was to just provide more detail. The standards, if you read, certainly going all the way to NIST cybersecurity framework under what is currently IDRA, says you need to perform risk assessments. I think that's moving to the governance function soon. ISO 27000 says you need to do risk assessments. NIST 882 says you need to do risk assessments. I-64432-1 says you need to do risk assessments, but there was never, other than some stuff in the informative annexes of those standards, there wasn't a lot of guidance on how to do that and what are the important elements. So number one, we developed it because there was this void of how to do a proper risk assessment, particularly in OT. One of the first things we did not want to reinvent the wheel. So we read all of the, not all, but we studied what was out there, the body of knowledge already out there. NIST has, for example, something called 830 and 839. Those are information security risk assessment standards. There's something from the Canadian Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP. They have a standard on information security risk assessment that we referenced. So we referenced a lot of different existing bodies of knowledge on best practices. And they're actually in the bibliography, if you want to see what they are. So what we didn't want to do is reinvent the wheel. But what we did want to do is recognize the fact that the consequences in OT are different than the consequences in IT.
Totally.
Most IT risk assessment methodologies are all around confidentiality and privacy. In OT, we want it to be around safety and availability. Those are, as you said, those are the things that are paramount. So number one is we wanted to incorporate safety and reliability and all of the aspects, the realistic aspects of running an OT environment. And not just make it about patching, as for example. So that's another reason why we developed the standard. And
well, you also have to remember the foundation is 10 years ago. Like I know there exists more standards, more governance, more available control methodologies today that align more with ICS or with OT. But we're still talking a decade ago, right? I mean, this was this was kind of first of its kind. So because I think a lot of people might argue, say, well, IT is not only about privacy and confidentiality. And I said, well, think about all the changes that we've seen in regulation over the course of the past 10 years. So I just wanted to lay that in as a detail.
Yep, that's true.
So we talked a little bit about the people side. We talked a little bit about, I think, how much time it's going to take to assemble all this data to really do a good analysis of all your different risk assessment, all your different systems under consideration. You decide to go forward with a detailed risk assessment. How does your overall tech stack, the complexity of that tech stack, maybe from facility to facility, or maybe even within one facility, can you talk briefly about the overall complexity that a tech stack may introduce into your 3-2 workflow, pulling more resources of time and people?
Yep. And that's one of the benefits of the zone and conduit approach. Like as I said, that's really was one of the things we were initially trying to tackle, was giving guidance on how to partition a system into zones and conduits, and not to go beyond just Purdue model levels, because people even 10 years ago were adopting the Purdue model and partitioning their systems by level. But zones and conduits are meant to be a level of granularity below that, typically, or complemented by the Purdue model, but not just a one-to-one repetition of the Purdue model. In other words, you can have multiple level 2 zones or multiple level 1 zones. You can even have zones that might cross Purdue level boundaries. It's rare, but it can happen. So the idea was to give guidance around, how to break it down into these zones and conduits. And that to get to your question about the tech stack, the technology at level 0 and level 1 is very different than the technology at level 3, 3.5 in an OT environment. It's much, 3.5 and 3 are really almost all IT technology at that level. And level 1 and level 0 is all industrial automation and sensors and actuators and PLCs and so on. So very, very different tech stack at those different levels. So by partitioning the system into these zones, so you have a very obvious zone. You're almost always going to have a demilitarized zone as one of your zones. In fact, it's now not uncommon to have multiple DMZs in your model. So the people that when you're studying that zone, the people that you invite and that you gather information from are the people and groups that have the information about that. So the makeup of a study team studying a demilitarized zone is going to be very different than the makeup of when you're on a level 1 zone. You're going to bring in different people, and that's kind of the beauty of the process. Is you're getting the information from those that have the knowledge, you're consolidating it, you're studying it in this kind of partitioned manner, so that you're not wasting people's time. You're not making somebody from let's say operations, a PLC technician sit in on the DMZ discussion. They're welcome. Oftentimes they're welcome, but they're not going to be able to contribute as much as they are when you're talking about the zones that they operate and maintain and design and build.
Well, and I think you cover. It's a great question, and now on the slide is really, or on the deck here is the last slide that you had presented. Just a couple bullet points to help guide the conversation. But we're at about halfway, and I'd love to really laser focus the remainder of our conversation on what's the upside, what's the benefit for a consultant, right? So just to level the playing field, we're talking about an internal consultant that might have an @assetowner.com email address. That's where I was when I was at Shell. Flew around from a corporate entity. What usually happens with an organization like that is there's a core skill set that is distributed at large across the organization, and that's all they do. I think that's the same kind of value that an external consultant can bring in. If this is what they're doing, John, tell me I'm wrong by saying this is an expert process. You have to really understand how to pull all this information. You have to be adept at it. You have to have done this so many times that you can accelerate a new project because you know all the right things to ask, right? So when you think about, I'm sorry, I didn't move this slide. As you think about the value of an internal external consultant, what are people not thinking about when they start a 3-2 project that a consultant would immediately say, I know how to do this faster, better, easier?
Yeah. some of it is just like you said, it's just the experience of having done many of these projects, just like any other project. Like a project manager that's done 20, 30 projects like this is going to be able to come in and say, okay, these are all things you need to do. These are the people you need to invite. These are the number of meetings and sessions we're going to have. This is where the information that's critical. This is when it's critical. So like you said, just that experience of having been through it is valuable in terms of just being more efficient. And then there's also that the value of facilitation.
Like
There
a
are a
third
lot of,
party, like somebody coming in and this is all they do, like they're going to kind of corral everybody together.
yeah. I mean, let's face it. Some of these conversations, as you work through the process is you take that your system, you partition it in zones, then it becomes very repetitive. We're going to today or this hour, we're going to focus on this zone. Then we're going to go to this zone. Becomes very repetitive. But like I said, different people, different perspectives. But it's being able to get through those, kind of lead those discussions. They can sometimes get a little tense and political. You're bringing together, if you're done right, you're bringing together people from different disciplines, IT security, automation, operations that don't always speak the same language.
By
So
design.
by
By
design, right?
design. I mean, we have a couple comments in this section where a couple people are focusing on, well, how do you just ignore some of those, OT risks to the OT environment? And I think ignore is not the right word. I think another person commented, you may not deploy a minimal amount of resources to that risk or that business outcome if the residual risk is, let's say, below your threshold. Well, that right there requires an element of collaboration across the company. And I think that the challenge a lot of folks have is they say, ISO IEC 62443, got to have it. This is the most widely adopted in OT. Okay, well, the CISO says, well, we have a new OT group. We have a new OT person. 60% of the time, that person's shifted over from IT. I see it less times that it's someone from operations coming in to learn cyber. And they say, well, I mean, I talked to somebody from the utilities industry the other day, and they said, we're going to get 3-2 rolled out to every facility. And I said, well, how much time do you have? And they said, we have 90 days. And I said, how many facilities do you have? They said, we have 80. And I said, okay, that's, first of all, like the idea you're going to roll 3-2 to every facility. To me, it showcased an element of need for that group. I said, you've got to bring in a consultant. You got to bring in somebody that has done this over and over and over, because they probably didn't have the underlying understanding of risk in general. They didn't have any threats that they had a database of. They didn't know all the business operations. I think that the number one reason somebody should bring in a consultant is because they've never done it before, John. I mean, what's your estimate of folks that after they see it done right the first time, that they can probably continue that process? Not to mention 3-2 is kind of an evolution and it never really should stop, right?
Right.
What is your idea on a conversion? People being able to do this on their own after they have a trusted guide walk them through it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I've been facilitating these for about a decade, and there are many companies make this part of their. They will refresh these every year or two on a cycle. So because a cyber is 3-2 assessment, or what a lot of times people call cyber PHA or cyber HAZOP assessments. Right. It's a snapshot in time, and risks, of course, are dynamic. So you want to repeat these at some frequency, update these studies. Things change, new threats, new vulnerabilities, new consequences, perhaps. So so as people start to get comfortable with the process, they can. Many of my clients have just taken over and they do their own, or maybe bring us in to just help with just the facilitation of the workshops, but they do all of the other legwork themselves, because it's like any methodology, right? Once you learn it, you get comfortable with it, and people and team members get comfortable with it. It's much easier to repeat.
Yeah, I agree. Well, what's the number one reason that you see? So not everybody can say they've been doing this for a decade, right? So when you come into an organization, and you guide them on their first, detailed risk assessment process. And then you
Mm-hmm.
come back, let's say 2 or 3 years later. What's the challenges that an asset owner should welcome?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's new people, maybe it's new threats. And what's something they can work on between those 2 and 3 years to streamline the process, in your opinion? Like,
Yeah.
if they know they're going to do it in a couple of years, how can they plan for that really effectively?
Well, it's a couple of things. So, it's largely based on change. Um, as I said, there are changes. There are external changes, environmental changes that you can't control. New
Right.
threats, for example, new
Sure.
vulnerabilities coming in from your suppliers. So the whole supply chain, issues.
Yep.
And then there's those things you can control, the changes you can control. And then almost always between studies, there have been deliberate changes to the control system and the control system architecture and the security stack, um, that you effectively want to take credit for. You've done these things. You've implemented additional security controls, different layers of protection. Oftentimes, what senior leadership wants to see from these repeat studies is, did we make any progress? We put a lot of
Yep.
money into this.
And what's
And
the
then,
ROI?
right. Yeah. They want to measure some way of measuring the level of risk reduction that was achieved from from the investments that were made.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the reasons why people repeat these studies. Number one, they want to learn about any new threats that have emerged over the between studies. But then they also want to be able to measure the effectiveness of the things that they have done. Are we going
Yeah.
in the right direction?
I don't think you could do that without an expert eye, whether that expert eye is internal or external. I think a lot of people underestimate the challenge of ROI in this space, right? This is a big one that I talk about a lot because I think I have an alternate view. And the alternate view is, how difficult is it to showcase that we are resilient? How difficult is it to showcase that all the investments we made over the last 18 months, if there hasn't been a kinetic attack or there hasn't been some sort of threat that was reduced, how do you go back and showcase that? How do you showcase that back to leadership? Not to mention, we're talking about an 18, 36-month role here.
Yeah.
I think the perspective, and this is really for non-technical C-suite that I would be talking to, but I think the perspective is, look, this is the business impacts that we are risking if we don't invest in cybersecurity. And that, let's just say that's a dollar amount. That dollar amount may fluctuate based on our P&L, but like that dollar amount, the next thing I would be looking for is, are we getting better as an organization to deploy those dollars? This gets into a real true blue auditing function, right? A lot of people use the word audit and assessment differently. To me, the difference is, if we're going to run a series of assessments, how effective have we been? Well, it took us 88 days start to finish the first time. We've gotten it down to 35 days. Overall, we've increased our frequency to every 7 months. Oh, and by the way, we haven't had to bring in an external consultant. Maybe we drop our spend by 40%. To me, those are the things that I'd be looking for, because I think that it shouldn't be point in time. I think a lot of people mess that up. They say, we're going to bring in an external consultant. We're going to do a 3-2. It's going to be awesome. And then that's it. It's the end of the project. Wouldn't you agree, John, that, we as an industry should be trying to facilitate a little bit more of a DIY, with the full expectation that getting you up to where you can do these yourself is either going to take training, it's going to take some external folks to help you. And then the efficiency of how that runs, that to me is a better case of ROI.
Yeah.
Because
two things you're talking about there. Well, one is, initially you may bring in consultants or a third party to help, just to learn the methodology, the process to get that down. At some point, organizations can take over that role once they learn the methodology, they get the tools in place. The other value of that internal or external consultant, but that kind of unbiased person, is to be able to challenge. What are the blind spots that we're not seeing?
I agree with
Are we drinking our own Kool-Aid? Are we kidding ourselves? You want to bring in that third party unbiased perspective. And that's why I say sometimes I'll only get invited to come sit in on the workshops.
Nice.
You
I
know,
think that's smart. Just
right.
to
Just to have
serve and
that.
say, hey, how's it going? Or
What aren't
add
we
an
think, what aren't we
perspective.
thinking about that, as somebody who has done these kind of studies across a lot of different clients, a lot of different industries, what things aren't we thinking about? So there's two main values of that, consultant facilitator. One is just the mechanics of the process. And
Right.
then there's the value that they'll bring in terms of just having that unbiased and broad perspective.
Well, somebody said, I think it was Oren Niskin, always joining us. He said, you can't smell, it's hard to smell your own breath. And it's true.
Yeah.
I am always a proponent of a single source of trust, right? It's something that I've been thinking a lot about, especially in the OT environment. I'm actually putting out a couple of data points on. Not everybody will agree, but if you have, check this idea out, right? You have a trusted advisory relationship. Let's say it's with an external group, and they are your true blue OT experts. I would even argue the value of that organization who does the first, let's say, year and a half of getting the 62443 workflow kind of really built into the organization. And then they sort of take a back seat. I would even invite, people may disagree, but if I was that external consultant, I would even invite maybe not a competitor per se, but another group to come in because they may have this little flair. And you're sitting in the back, you're like, okay, 18 months ago, I taught these folks how to do that. Let's bring in these folks. It's healthy. Do you agree, John?
I do. In fact, I can tell a story about that because I was brought in to facilitate a 3-2 risk assessment for a pipeline
Right.
midstream client, and I walk in the room and there's Dale Peterson, who I recognize. Like, Dale, why are you here? And he had been hired by the asset owner, by the CISO, to come in and audit the process
Right.
because they wanted that another set of eyes
Yep.
on the process. So there is value in you can't afford to bring in a lot of different third parties, but yeah, maybe not. There's some value in not always using the same consultant. We get that a lot. I've seen that a lot in just in gap assessments where
Mhm.
CISOs will say, okay, last year we had XYZ consultant come in and do our gap assessment. This year we're going to have ABC company come in and do it because they want that different perspective.
I think
And
that's smart.
different challenges, challenging their staff so that they're not always giving the same answers.
Well, and I think so. You and I are in agreement, but I will offer two risks, right? I think that you can. I would apply the law of diminishing returns because I have been in a room when the same RFP was actually matched by 3 different companies, and then all 3 of them come in at the same time. That's not the fault of the vendors, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think if you have too many people in a room, too many data models, too many,
Yep.
too many
Yep.
of one thing is a bad thing. But the
I
second
want a
thing is,
manageable size team. To me, the ideal study team size for these is about 6 to 10 people.
yeah, I was going to say 6 to 8.
I walked into one once and there were 20 some people in the room. I'm like, okay,
that becomes a problem.
this is going to be challenging, right?
Well, you can't offer. It's just too much data will break the model, and that's the second piece. Is that because I sit in this world of data modeling, longevity, where the data records long term. So when you think about all your gap assessments that you've done over the course of 5 years, when you think about maybe accelerating those into more of a risk assessment methodology, the challenge with bringing in a different firm or a different consultant every couple of years is that if they're not operating on the same data model, then the CISO and the OT and the IT directors are really confused.
Yeah.
And there are so many different types of frameworks. There's so many different methodologies. That's why I love 62443, because it gives you a standard workflow and then you can kind of bend it in the way that you want, but you're not changing the fundamental workflow. When you look at an NCSF at 882, and even you look at some privacy or some like GDPR, what NIS2 coming out with in Europe, there's so much ways you can change the questions and the controls and the impacts and the threats and the risks that they become their own framework type. And so an additional challenge we have in the industry is there's value in kind of changing it to your needs, but there's also a longevity issue if you don't scale that appropriately within one data model. So, I have a question that I wanted to ask you. You've been doing this for more than a decade. I've said it once, I'll say it again. Not many people that have been deploying 3-2 over the course of time that long. What would you argue is the best state of mind that an asset owner leadership team should be in to benefit from a 3-2? You coming in as an advisor, like, what is the kind of persona or the group, or what kind of state is that company in that they're going to benefit the most from a 3-2?
Yeah, good point. So one of the things when over the years that I've learned is you never call it an audit.
Right.
Even an assessment is. I actually prefer to use the term study, because that's really what it is. It's a study. It's an engineering study. Because you want people to be open-minded when they're participating in these as much as possible. People are going to bring their perspective. Sometimes they're going to bring their political baggage into the room or into the study, and as much as possible, you want to try to, at least manage that. Give everybody an opportunity to speak and share their thoughts, but the value of a facilitator is to kind of corral that and keep things in line. From a leadership management perspective, it's letting the team know that by participating in the study, we want you to be open. We want you to share. Don't want you to be guarded. We don't want you to feel like if you bring up something in this study that you're going to get in trouble for exposing dirty laundry.
Right.
That's where I've seen challenges. There's that some people get kind of instantly guarded when participating in a study like this, and defensive. This is my, and I can understand it too. I completely get the perspective, having been, somebody that designed and deployed PLC and DCS systems. That's, you put a lot of time and energy, and that's your system, and don't want anybody calling your baby ugly, right? So I can understand why people who naturally might get defensive, because you're digging into details. You're asking questions about, well, what about this? What about this? Did we think about this? Some people may get, naturally get defensive. And that's one of the things you want to try to, as quickly as possible, kind of, make it a safe space, get people to understand that we're all in this together. We're trying to understand and quantify as best as you can, quantify the risk, or rank the risk is a better term, so that you can make good decisions about what to do with that risk. Getting to that question that the person asked, you're not ignoring any risks. What you're doing with the risks, you're identifying them, and you're deciding whether you're going to tolerate that risk, whether you're going to treat that risk by applying. We always talk about tolerate, treat, transfer, and terminate. Those are the four things you can do with risk. So you're trying to make those decisions. Are you going to tolerate it? Are you going to treat it? Are you going to terminate it somehow, get rid of it? Or are you going to transfer it to somebody else, make it somebody else's problem? Those are your choices. And so we're not ignoring any risks. What we're doing is we're identifying them and ranking them and making some kind of disposition. How are we going to manage it?
Couldn't agree more. Well put. Well, we're at time, and it's funny. People ask me, like, what do you do for a living? And I tell them sometimes, I said, well, I'm in the business of selling software licenses. I mean, that's the business model if you really want to know. But if you really want to know what I do, I'm in the business of marriage counseling for OT and IT. Because, I mean, you're talking about a safe place. There's no boundaries. We're talking about all. The truth is that we've got a limited number of resources that we've got to spread across a growing number of facilities. We got all these threats and these vulnerabilities that are going to continue to rise. We don't have enough qualified people in the space. And budget dollars are just not going up and up and up at the same commensurate level as the threats and the risks are. And so when we really think about the core persona that I think can benefit from this kind of study, that is actively going to look for an internal or an external consultant. To me, there's somebody that is humble enough to know they haven't figured it all out, and resilient enough to know that they've got to, and they want to bring in some expertise to help them get there. The good news is that I see an increasing number of CISOs that are getting ahead of the problem. And they're saying, look, I know we've got some challenges here. Let's work together. Let's figure this out. And that's why I see such a strong demand for products and services in this space on this issue alone. And I'm so glad that you were able to share your decade plus just on this endeavor. Appreciate everything you've done for the industry. I think we've answered every question that our attendees asked us, but I will give you the last moment. How can people get a hold of you or ask more questions, John?
Oh, well, they can get a hold of me easily just through my email. It's john.cusimano@armexa.com. And yeah, thank you for having me on the show. I think the industry wants to move in a risk-based direction. That's what we did with safety 20 years ago. Move from prescriptive to performance-based. And 3-2, that's really why it was developed, was to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's I think the industry's in a good place. I think we're moving in the right direction, but it takes folks like yourself and folks like that have been on the show and hopefully will continue to come on the show to give their perspectives. John, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for what you do for this industry. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about resources. There aren't enough of them in cybersecurity, so you got to use them wisely. This is the Business of Cyber Show. Join us next week on Tuesday. We're going to be talking about the ISA IEC 62443 4-1 certification process. We're going to have somebody that has years of experience at an actual OEM as well as a consultant to talk about the secure lifecycle and product management and making sure that's secure. So join us, and we look forward to seeing you. You guys have a great week, and go share the wealth of knowledge out there. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you, Ted.